Okay. All right, this is Brent Rains for Alternate Perceptions Online Magazine. And once again, I'm talking with Dr. Gregory Little. This is part 4 of From Psychology to Indian Mounds. And what we're going to talk about this time comes from actually one of the main themes in a book that he and British author Andrew Collins wrote entitled Denisovan Origins. And it's going to concern the giant skeletal remains of people who were found in Indian mounds here in North America. And so, can you go ahead and jump in on that?
Sure.
Greg?
Well, actually, it's in a couple books. Also, the book Path of Souls. There's quite a bit of information, and actually more detailed information. Basically, what it boils down to is this. In the 1800s, in the late 1800s, the Smithsonian was tasked by the U.S. Congress to do a mound exploration project. And initially, it was done through what was called the Bureau of Ethnology, which later became known as the Bureau of American Ethnology. And I can't tell you how many times people have said, oh, you're wrong, it's not the Bureau of Ethnology, it's the Bureau of American Ethnology. I say, yeah, but it started out as the Bureau of Ethnology, and about 20 years later, they changed the name to the Bureau of American Ethnology. Anyway, in the 1800s, they did this survey. They sent out 3 different field agents to different areas of the country, and they were tasked with trying to find out who built the mounds. We know who built the mounds. It's the ancestors of the Native Americans, which says a lot, but it doesn't really say everything, because exactly who the ancient Native Americans were is another question. Anyway, when they did this survey, they dug into about 2,000 to 3,000 mounds. And in the digging into these 2,000 to 3,000 mounds, they basically recovered 50,000 artifacts, which they sent off to the Smithsonian. Now, they were only trying to collect the very best of artifacts. They were not tasked with collecting skeletons, but what they did do was find a large number of gigantic skeletons in the mounds. In fact, they found and reported 17 skeletons recovered from mounds that were 7 feet to roughly 7.5 or a little bit more, 7.5 feet, maybe 7 feet 8 inches or so. 17 of them. Now, that's just one group that did it, just the Smithsonian. There are many others that did it, including the Carnegie Institution. They sponsored several digs in the mounds, which in fact did recover some giant skeletons too. So if you actually read the literature today and you get into what skeptics say, skeptics deny every one of those. They say they were mismeasured. The people back then didn't know what they were doing, even though some of the field agents that were out there were professionals. They were doctors. Archaeologists didn't really exist then. But what we did have were a lot of people that were doing real good scientific archaeology work. And they consisted of geologists and physicians who did a lot of the work that the Smithsonian and others sponsored. So anyway, that's really the giants in the mounds here in America and North America. We know, too, that the very first Spanish explorers, and we'll talk about Hernando de Soto for a minute. In 1541, de Soto landed in Florida near Tampa and did this several-year trek through the entire Southeast, making it all the way to Texas. They went through, let's see if I can remember all these, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, got into a bit of South Carolina, went through a bit of Tennessee, went through Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, into Texas and Louisiana, probably even made it into north or southern Missouri. And then de Soto died, and his entire crew got on the Mississippi River, floated south, and walked to Mexico, literally walked along the shoreline of the Gulf of Mexico to get back to Mexico to safety. During that trek that de Soto took, there were several encounters with what he described as giants. His chroniclers wrote a lot about them. One of the more famous events took place in Alabama at a place called Mabila, M-A-B-I-L-A. At Mabila, de Soto was met by a very tall, very young man in superb condition. He was described as at least 7.5 feet tall, and he was the son of the king or the chief. And the chief's name was Tuscaloosa. And Tuscaloosa, Alabama is named after him. When DeSoto went to meet the king then, or the chief, Tuscaloosa was seated at the very top of steps going up a huge truncated pyramid mound in Alabama. And he came down the mound and he dwarfed DeSoto and his men. He was at least 7.5 feet tall, probably more than that, but the best guesstimates are that he was at least 7.5 feet tall. He was so big that DeSoto convinced Tuscaloosa to take them to the main village where Tuscaloosa said there was gold. And along the way, DeSoto wanted Tuscaloosa to ride on one of his horses. And he got the biggest pack horse that they had. And Tuscaloosa could just stand on the ground, put his feet over the horse, and stand on it. His feet literally drug on the ground with the horse.
Wow.
It's a long, involved story. Anyway, DeSoto and his men literally burned to death and savagely and rather brutally killed over 5,000 warriors at Mabila, including probably Tuscaloosa, although Tuscaloosa's body was never found. His men did find the body of Tuscaloosa's son, who led an attack outside this fortress near Mabila, where the large mound complex and supposedly gold was. But DeSoto didn't get any gold at all. That is just one of the accounts. There were some earlier visits by the Spanish along the eastern Florida coast where the Timucuans were. And the Spanish encountered a whole bunch, a tribe of 7-foot tall people. We know, too, that early explorers, European explorers that made it into South America, particularly when they were trying to get around the tip of South America, the Straits of Magellan, the weather was so bad that they had to stay there during the winter months. And they encountered a huge tribe, and these people, they were called the Ona and the Taluchians, and they were well over 7 feet in height. In fact, they were literally exterminated by the later Spanish explorers and the European settlers that came into South America. So we know that there were what they described as giants. And when I use the term giants, people that were 7.5 feet tall, their wives were 6 to 7 feet in height. Children were very big, and they literally dwarfed the Spanish. And so the Spanish tried to literally exterminate them. The father of modern, not eugenics, but evolution, Charles Darwin, actually watched some of the extermination of the Ona and the Taluchi. He wrote about it in several books, and it very much upset him. But that's all another story. So we know for certain that there were giants in the America, or when I use the term giants, again, got to understand I'm talking about people 7 and 7.5 feet tall. Now, one of the things people do, I want to throw this out quickly, and then we can get into some other things here. Skeptics would often say, there's lots of 7 feet tall people. Look at the NBA. Well, statistically speaking, today, when we have better nutrition, better health, and all that, and we live longer, there are a lot of 7-footers. It's basically one out of approximately every 200,000 people or so reach 7 feet in height. One out of every 200,000 or so. Most of those people don't become warriors. They don't become NBA players. They simply get too big for their physical body to handle that size. And they generally die fairly early. But the NBA really hasn't had that many 7-footers. We know that height is one of the most exaggerated things in college basketball, and in the pros. A lot of the people that they say are 7 feet are actually not 7 feet. And statistically, there's a real big difference between people that are truly 7 feet tall and those that are maybe 6'10" or 6'9". There's a lot of people that are 6'9" today. but not very many that are 7 feet tall. And that argument, anyway, falls apart when you look at the ancient mounds. There's one particular area near South Charleston in West Virginia where 7 to 8 foot tall skeletal remains that were buried very, very prominently in burial mounds there along the Kanawha River. There are 7 in that one little area, and they pulled a total of about 50 skeletons out of those 7 mounds, or out of those mounds, and there were 7 giants out of 50, and they are all believed to be shaman because of the artifacts that were found then. So it's pretty clear that the elite of this ancient society were very, very tall people. And that's kind of a summary of it all.
Yeah, and we know that they've been doing genetic studies on Native Americans.
There have been, yes.
And what about the giants?
Okay. Well, okay. There has been no testing whatsoever of any of these giant skeletal remains because they don't have any of them anymore. A lot of people say it's a big cover up by the Smithsonian, but like I said when I started this, when the Smithsonian sent their field agents out, they were not tasked with collecting skeletal remains. The Smithsonian in those early days was very interested in obtaining artifacts for display, not skeletal remains. So what the field agents often did when they exposed these, sometimes they took the skull because they were very, very large and they sent those to the Smithsonian. Sometimes the skeletons literally crumbled and fell apart when they were exposed to air, so they were no longer solid bones. Others were literally packed and shipped to the Smithsonian and simply stored away. In 1989 and 1990, the Smithsonian started repatriating all those remains to Native American tribes. And so today, many, many years later, we're looking at 30 years later, 31, 32 years after that, the Smithsonian has none of them. And it is illegal to test the skeletal remains of Native Americans unless they're living Native Americans and they give you permission. Otherwise, you need to get permission from whatever tribe claims those skeletal remains. Before 1989 and 90, when these laws were passed, there were some studies done of skeletal remains, and what they found in the mounds that are attributed to the giants, the ones that generally had the giants in them, there is a type of mitochondrial DNA. We don't have time to discuss that. We have maybe 5 minutes left, and we certainly can't get into discussing too much of mitochondrial DNA. But there is one called haplogroup X, X as in unknown. When they first discovered the mitochondrial DNA, what they found it was actually surprising. They were testing living Native American DNA to try and figure out why certain Native American tribes had a high incidence of some diseases, such as the Blackfeet tribe, which are in the central North America. They wanted to know about diseases that they had. The Pima Indian tribe that has a huge problem with obesity and with type 2 diabetes. They actually have babies that are born with type 2 diabetes, which is unbelievable, actually. But what they did when they tested their DNA, their human DNA, they pulled mitochondrial DNA, which is also found in human cells, and they tested it as kind of a sideline, a control, because they didn't believe there were different types of mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondria are tiny little vestigial bacteria that are found in all of our cells. What they do is they consume glucose. I'm using the word consume just to make this easy. And the byproduct of their consumption of glucose is what is called ATP, adenotriphosphate, which is what our bodies use for energy. So they create energy for us. Without them, we would die instantly. Anyway, they found that initially there were 4 types. They called them A, B, C, D. Just out of convenience. Well, we'll call them haplogroup A, B, C, D. Haplogroup means type. That's all it means, a specific type. A few years later, they found this one pop up in living Native Americans, and about 1 to 2% of living Native Americans, mainly those that were living in the mound builder areas around Illinois, upper Pennsylvania, New York State, some in Michigan, and those areas around the Great Lakes, mainly the Iroquois areas. And it was called X, as in unknown. At that time, they didn't realize we're going to find a whole lot more of these. But X turned up in about half of the skeletal remains that were tested out of the mounds that had been excavated in the Northeast. And this X haplogroup is not found, the origin is not known. It's the only one of roughly 32 major haplogroups that has no origin, but it's very and most heavily found in Native American skeletal remains. There is one group in the world that has a living group that has a higher percentage of X, and that they are the Druze that are in Lebanon near Israel. There are also some of the Druze that are in Israel, but haplogroup X is found in roughly 50% of their population too. Otherwise, it's found in the Orkney Islands. Some is found in Israel and around in little narrow areas around the Mediterranean, but that's about it. So we know it's not European DNA. It probably was Solutrean DNA. Solutrean was a group that was found in the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain and France around 18,000 years ago. And they made points very similar to Americus Clovis. So some of the belief here, and what's in our book, Denisovan Origins, is that these Solutreans were a group of migrating Denisovans, which we don't have time to get into either. That is a extinct branch of humanity, of very tall, very robust humans that moved into France around 18 to 20,000 years ago. And eventually, some of them found their way to North America and became the elite of the mound building populations that were probably already there. We know there were already people in the Americas by 10 to 12,000 BC. So that's kind of a summary of it. It's very clear there were exceedingly tall people, which to the people who first encountered them, they were giants. That's what they call them. And actually, if you ever stand next to a group of 7-foot tall people, you will feel like a pygmy, and they will seem like giants to you. So they were killed off. They were the fiercest people that were around, and when you are a conquering nation, or when you're conquistadors, you get rid of the warrior population first, and those would be the giants. So that's kind of a summary of it all. And all I did was kind of gloss over it all. So in your encounters with some Native Americans, I know you once talked about the Susquehannocks. I went to the home of the Susquehannocks in Pennsylvania, which is very near the New York border, and saw the area near a huge hill that was a fortress that they built. I can't remember the town now. It'll pop into my head. It's right on the Pennsylvania-New York border on the Susquehanna River. And the Susquehannocks was a tribe that were Iroquois in nature. Almost there, the Cherokee are Iroquois also. Very few people know that. They are a separate tribe, but they are remote relatives of the Iroquois that went from the north, migrated from the north to the south when the Iroquois became very successful at procreating. Some of them went to the west. Some of them went to the south. Some of them went to a little further to the southwest of the plains. But the Iroquois the main Iroquois tribes became enemies with the Susquehannocks, and along with the British, literally exterminate them. So that's the story there. But I know you know some about the Susquehannocks. You have spoken with somebody there. Is that not correct?
Yeah, in South southeastern Pennsylvania in what's Mahoney City off of Route 95. I had been visited twice. A Native American shaman who was an urban Indian at this point in his later years, but I met he and his wife. I went there in April of '76, and then I revisited him in April of '77, at which time Joan was my wife. Joan was with me, and anyway, I'm I always refer to him as Sequanahawk, the way I went by the spelling, but
it's Susquehannocks. I was raised by the Susquehanna River. That's actually why I went up there. It was a trip going back home, and we decided we'll go on up the Susquehanna River. But go ahead.
He talked about giant beings who protected his ancestors, and he said that they went back to glacier periods and earlier, and that they protected his ancestors from the giant beasts of that time. I guess, the saber-toothed tiger or whatever. He talked about actually having a visitation from what he called a fire canoe, which to us would be a UFO, and that they came and they bent down, they came into the house, and they were very tall, and told about this one that had like a beam of light that came out of between his shoulder blades, and it stopped about a foot from his body, and just, which I hadn't heard of until later years. I've heard of beams of light from aliens and UFOs, doing that kind of thing. But anyway, it was just very interesting to hear his stories, legends, and so on, and the experiences that he described having himself, and as well as his wife. And he actually would, when he was about 4 years old, he said he built his first prayer mound under the instruction of his elders, which was in the shape of a turtle, which was part of their totem. And during that last visit, we had an experience where we both were invited after we had lunch with he and his wife to go to the living room. And he said, we'll have a powwow. Now, he said he never used any drugs or anything in what he did. But this was a tobacco. He took out his pipe and he started smoking. He said, we're going to have a powwow. And we didn't know what we were in for. But we got very relaxed. And we didn't talk about this till maybe a couple days later, at how kind of unusual it was. But anyway, we were just very relaxed. He was smoking his pipe. Nobody really said anything. And and then afterwards, it was kind of like we entered a deep meditation. For me, I almost felt like I was going into a trance. And I talked about it a couple of days later when we were up at my parents' home in Maine, and I was describing to her how I felt. And then she started describing what she had experienced. And she said the smoke from this pipe, I think I had gone inward and she was seeing what was going on. The smoke would go in a horizontal fashion, burst out like this, then it would come back together, and then it would go vertical, come back together, and then it would go horizontal again, come back together. And this went on for a while. She said she was actually seeing this. And then it was like seeing down a tunnel his face, and he was looking at her, and then the whole spell was broken. And we spoke later with Madeline Teagle up in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, who was a UFO contactee, but Pot Iroquois. And we were describing this, and she says, well, that sounds like their balanced way. She said the cross, that kind of a cross is an important symbol of their balanced way, is how she said it.
Okay. Interesting.
And so, last year we were attending a talk by an archaeologist from the University of Tennessee from Knoxville down here at the Indian Mound Museum in Florence, Alabama. And he had been exploring all these caves with Indian artwork, and he was draw this cross-shaped symbol and explained how here's this vertical line here in the the center going out, that's our world. Then up above it is the upper world, below it's the lower world. And I thought, hey, that's what Joan experienced back in 1977, you know.
Yeah.
Very similar.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, I really believe that Native American cosmology and their belief system is a lot richer and a lot more important than what probably anybody but Native Americans would think. I'm sure they think it's important, but I really think that they have found something and believed in something that has some real validity to it. And that's what I've written about in the new material, which is not out yet, of course. But it's all very interesting. I probably should have stuck some of your Susquehannock story in the book. I wish I'd stuck that in Path of Souls. But there are lots of tribes that had a belief system and mythology that incorporates giants into it, not just the giant animals, but giants that lived in the tribe who protected the tribe from bad giants or evil giants. They often said the evil giants were cannibals. Lots of mythology in that, lots of legends and stories. And of course, archaeology doesn't like legends and stories, but as we know, legends and mythology has truth to it. All myths have some basis in reality. So there was very clearly something going on. And my bottom line to all these talks that we've done, the bottom line is pretty simple, and that is we really don't know the truth about our origins and the ancient world. It's all up for grabs. And I think almost everything that we've been told about the ultimate origins and so on is wrong. I think all of it's wrong. We're still muddling around a little bit and haven't quite gotten there. But the science part, that is archaeology, is behind the alternative researchers. I think they're well behind it. And they actually follow some of the alternative researchers. That is, they read what the alternative people like Andrew Collins and Graham Hancock say, and then they dovetail off of it, but they never really give them credit. And they literally just ignore them and say, well, they got all these other crackpot ideas. So they just kind of ignore it. Okay, well, all right. Well, I've pretty much said what I needed to. It's always good. I love these short ones, but the truth is you never really get to go into any depth in them. But we'll do that at some point.
Yeah, and we'll, it's
We'll just
this is a
continue on. We'll
series.
plug ahead.
That's right.
All
On
right.
to the next.
So till next time,
Yes.
stay in there. And I'm not sure where we'll go next time, but it'll be somewhere interesting.
Always interesting.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Greg.
All
Very
right.
much
Take care.
appreciate it. You too.
Bye-bye, everybody.